My family is originally from a small fishing village called Catalina, Newfoundland. 4 or 5 miles north of Catalina is a small village called Little Catalina. The surrounding area is covered in small ponds and bogs. In 1930, the town of Catalina held a dance for the local youths. My great-grandmother was about 13 years old at this time, and she was in attendance at the dance. According to my great-grandmother, a small girl from Little Catalina also attended the dance, walking the few miles to get there. Unfortunately, the girl's name has been lost in history. Well, that night was unusually dark, as fog rolled in from the North Atlantic. The dance finished at about 9 p.m, and everybody went home. My great-grandmother said that the next morning the little girl's parents were riding their wagon through the town. They stopped off at every house along the way looking for their daughter. They thought that maybe she had stayed in Catalina with friends or relatives. One boy said that he'd seen her walking up the road towards Little Catalina after the dance. A search party was organised, and for 2 weeks, local men searched the forests and bogs. Fishing boats scanned the coastline. Unfortunately, the little girl was never found. Eventually, everybody came to the grim conclusion that she must have gotten lost in the dark and fallen into a bog hole. Those bogs are like quicksand and will suck you down within minutes. Months later, one man claimed to have seen the girl floating across the bogs one evening. He said that he attempted to go out to her, but she quickly disappeared into the forest. I suppose nobody ever put any real weight behind these claims, because the man was a known drunk. Years later, probably in the early 1920s, my great-grandmother said that she was out picking berries with her sister as the sun began to set. She said that as she looked across the bog, she saw a girl floating steadily and smoothly across the ground. She said her movement was so smooth that there's no possibility that it was a person walking. My great-grandmother claims to have seen the girl a few more times over the years before she passed away in 1991. In the summer of 2008, I was 16 years old. My grandfather and I were spending the summer in Little Catalina with some relatives. Being old enough to drive, I spent most of my days in Catalina at the swimming hole. One day, I was driving back with a distant cousin. As we were driving past those bogs, he pointed out the windshield and said, "What is that?" When I looked over, I saw a girl standing in the bog. The strange thing was her height. She seemed overly tall for the distance. We were probably about 40 feet away. I would have guessed that she would have to have been around 7 feet tall, but her proportions didn't seem to match being that tall. I slowed down and asked my cousin, who is local to the area, if he knew her. He said no. He said that he'd never seen her before. The girl then turned around before she quickly and smoothly floated away behind some trees. My cousin and I were genuinely freaked out and quickly drove back home. When I got home, I told my grandfather what I'd seen. He reacted with a grunt and told me the story that my great-grandmother had told him. He said that over the years, he'd heard people relaying stories of seeing the ghost of the girl in the bog. He said he always thought it was just a story to keep kids from playing out there because it was so dangerous. I know what I saw, and I know that this is more than just a story. Please bear with me. I am in no way a writer, and I don't have that much experience with the paranormal, nor do I wish to. The following is my only real experience with the paranormal, and it took place a few years ago at my house, where I have lived since the end of 2011. The house belonged to my father in the 1980s, before he passed away. The only other questionable experience I've had was when my mother came to me in 2016. This was during a period where I was being irresponsible about the way I was living my life. I'm not even 100% sure whether it really happened or it was just a dream. But I won't get into that right now. So, in the summer of 2021, in the height of this whole COVID mess, I decided to build a garage/workshop at the bottom of my garden. I hired a mini digger to dig most of the footings out, ready for the concrete pour. I remember my son, who was almost 13 at the time, was helping me prepare the footings. When we were digging the trenches, my son came across some old ladies' cosmetics that were in surprisingly good condition, considering they'd been buried underground. I remember thinking this is a really odd thing to find, especially as I had lived in the house since 2011, and my father lived in the house before me since 1986. Anyway, I enlisted the help of a friend to help to pour and level out the concrete. After we'd finished work for the day, I quickly dropped him back to his place. I returned home to find my son mopping the kitchen and dining room. We had made quite a mess going back and forth to the garden. I paused for a minute to take a moment to appreciate how much of a help he'd been all morning. It's usually quite a task just getting him off his Xbox. I said to him, "Shall we have a cup of tea and some leftover birthday cake?" as it had been my birthday a few days before. While we were waiting for the kettle to boil, we started eating the cake, and I joked about how big his slice was compared to mine. Suddenly, his face dropped, and his expression went from one of joy and laughter to one of complete shock and horror. He even spat out the cake that was in his mouth. He was looking towards the patio doors and the garden beyond. I turned around to observe what my son was looking at. Seeing nothing, I asked him what was wrong. He slowly raised his finger, pointing towards the open patio door. It was like he tried to speak, but couldn't. I said to him, "There's nothing there," at which point his face dropped even more. With his voice trembling, he then said, through tears of sheer terror, "It's gone upstairs." The stairway runs from the kitchen to the first floor. Almost immediately after, he started windmill punching what seemed to me like nothing but thin air. My mind was working overtime, trying to come up with answers and rationalise what was happening. All I could think to do was to pick my son up, carry him into the living room, place him on the sofa, and sit down next to him. He immediately, frantically, picked up the couch throw, placed it over his head, and sat there, uncontrollably sobbing. He would take it off momentarily every few seconds to check every corner of the room before placing it back over his face. At one point, he shouted, "It's right there in front of you," before placing it back over his head. Again, I couldn't see anything. He kept saying over and over again, "It's got no eyes, but it can see me." With the throw covering his head, he placed his hands over his ears and started shouting, "Shut up," repeatedly. I said to him, "I'm not saying anything," and he said, "I'm not talking to you." He then asked me where I was, because he could feel people sitting on either side of him. I confirmed that I was sat on his right hand side and held his hand. A few seconds later, he said, "It's got my leg," and my son's leg shot up in the air. I grabbed him by his waist, and it took all of my strength to keep hold of him. It was at this point that I was absolutely convinced my son was telling the truth, and there was something there that I just couldn't see. The jostling lasted for about 10 seconds before whatever had its grip on my son let go. I reached for the phone on the coffee table to call my older brother. He lives nearby, and he's the most religious member of our immediate family. As I picked the phone up, it felt like it was slapped out of my hand. It hit the floor and slid across to the other side of the room. I retrieved the phone and quickly made the call to my brother. I asked him to come round immediately and briefly explain what was going on. My son was still sat on the sofa, covering his face with that throw. He was still covering his ears with his hands, and repeatedly saying things like, "Please leave me alone, it's not true." As soon as I heard my brother's car pull up outside, my son pulled the throw down from his face and said with some relief, "It's going now, it's gone." After everything had calmed down, I asked my son what it was saying to him. He wouldn't tell me initially, but once I'd left the room, he told his uncle. Apparently, this thing was talking about me, saying that I was a bad father, and that I wasn't his real dad. This thing was telling my son that it was his real dad. Unsurprisingly, my son decided to spend the remainder of the evening at his mother's, who lives across the other side of town. Later that night, however, when I was lying in bed, I received an abundance of texts and calls from my son saying that this thing had followed him. He said he could hear it, and he sounded truly terrified on the phone. There wasn't really all that much I could do at the time, but try to reassure him. Me and his mother have been estranged for years now. I received some verbal abuse on the phone from his mother, as I was forced to call her to ask her to go upstairs to check on our son. I explained to her that he was calling me to ask me to help him in a situation where I just couldn't. Thankfully, after that, we haven't had any recurrences of whatever that was. Me and my son talked about it in the months that followed. However, as he's gotten older, he refuses to be drawn into conversation about it. I am convinced that we disturbed something supernatural while we were digging out those footings. I just hope to God that we've seen the last of it. Have you ever encountered anything like this? I was a freshman in college in Tallahassee, Florida, during the 2017-2018 school year. Let me preface this by saying I never believed in the paranormal or supernatural prior to my experiences there. So, the summer after my high school graduation, many of my friends had to take a mandatory summer term as a sort of orientation at FSU. I went to visit for a weekend to kind of get a feel for the city before I moved up there in the fall. While I was staying in my friend's, soon-to-be roommate's dorm room, he woke me up on his way to class, so I figured I'd take a walk around the campus. When I entered the stairwell, I noticed the initials TB written on the window, as someone would with their finger in the morning dew. I figured it was some type of tradition for the kids, so I tried to write my own initials. Except I couldn't, because they were written from the outside. At this point, I didn't know too much about Ted Bundy besides him being a serial killer. I had no idea that his killings were in Tallahassee, or that there were ghost stories attached either. Fast forward to the fall semester. We lived in a house just across from St. Louis Park. This was a nature trail attached to a historic mission from the 1800s. The whole trail is a complete circle with paths that branch off toward the centre if you wanted to take a shortcut. Except for one spot where there is a perfect fork in the road. I remember being with two of my roommates walking our dog along the trail when we came to that fork. We stood there for a minute or so, deciding which way to go. I looked up and I saw something really strange. There was a Grim Reaper doll sitting about 30 to 40 feet in the air on a tree branch. I didn't think much of it at the time, as it looked like it could have just been a Halloween decoration. Why somebody would go through the trouble of putting it all the way up there, I haven't the slightest idea. I mean, the tree stood about 15 feet back from the fork, with thick brush in between. But there it was. Then we were hit by Hurricane Irma. So I went out of state for a few days. When I arrived back in Tallahassee, the first thing I did was go to that trail to see if it was still walkable. I arrived at that fork and noticed that the tree was still standing there, but there was no Grim Reaper. So, out of curiosity, I decided to have a look around for it. I'd been looking for around 5 minutes, and I decided to give up. Right when I said to my roommate, "Dude, where the fuck is it?" I looked up, and there it was. Not laying on the ground, but sitting perfectly upright on a branch that had been knocked clean out of that tree. Again, I didn't believe in the paranormal, so I took it home as I figured it would be a nice addition to the house. And boy, was it. The roommate in the master bedroom was the resident stoner of the house. We would always partake in herbs and wax in his bedroom. One day, I was out of class early and got home before anyone else. So I went into that room to roll up. As I was rolling, I noticed the box fan on his nightstand started rocking backwards and forwards. My first instinct was to call his dog, but he was downstairs at the time. My next thought was, did a rat just run by and hit the power cord? I got down on my hands and knees, face flat against the floor, and scanned the whole room. Nothing. Both his bed and drawers were raised off the ground. From where I was, I could see around the whole room, and I was completely alone. As I was getting back up to walk back to the table, I could hear something behind me. I turned around, and to my horror, the bedroom door was slowly opening. Something definitely pushed that door open, and to this day, I have no idea what it was. A few months went by, and not much happened in between. Incidentally, I do remember having a look around the woods adjacent to our house. The trail where I found the doll was on the opposite side of the street. There were decades-old beer cans and plastic bottles scattered across the ground. But, sitting amongst the litter, of all things, I found an old sword just sitting there. There was nobody else around, so I took the sword home because, well, who doesn't want a sword? Now, it's the end of spring semester, and we were all getting ready to move out. This is when the weird stuff started happening. We had an absolute ton of stuff that was just going to get thrown out. So we got the sword out and started doing what guys do best. Sure as shit, the old decrepit thing breaks off in the hilt. But that wasn't going to stop us. One of my friends grabbed the bare blade and basically cut his palm right open while he was messing with it. We went back inside and he sat up on the countertop next to the sink while we applied pressure to the wound to stop the bleeding. It wasn't a really nasty gash that needed stitches or anything. However, he went completely limp and fell over, banging his head on the cabinet in the process. He woke up shaking, in a cold sweat. He isn't hemophobic in the slightest, and there really wasn't that much blood, so it was all just a bit strange. Now, it's move-out time. All our belongings were put into a U-Haul, and we were all sleeping on bedrolls in the living room for the last night. There were 6 of us, plus 3 friends from back home, all waiting downstairs for the Ubers to show up to take us to the bars. While we were waiting, we all heard a really loud boom coming from upstairs. It was directly above us, and was definitely coming from the master bedroom. It really sounded like a bowling ball had been slammed on the floor from a great height. I went upstairs to check it out, and that room was completely empty. There was nobody in there. No furniture. Nothing. In fact, there was nothing anywhere upstairs in that house that could have made that noise. Everything was in the U-Haul already. It was a completely empty room. I convinced myself it was the ghost's way of saying one last farewell. Having said that, it's been 7 years now, and that noise still haunts me. I've had plenty of encounters in my life that I just can't explain. A few of them were really scary indeed. But the following recollection remains to be by far the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. This happened approximately 8 years ago. My grandparents live in a house with a history of paranormal activity. When my mum and my aunts and uncles were kids, they had many weird and frightening experiences around that house. Things like books flying off shelves in the living room, and doors opening and slamming shut on their own. There was also a creepy doll that seemed to move of its own accord. Almost 60 years ago now, my grandparents first went to view that house. As they were having a look around, my grandmother asked about the history of the house. It was at this point that they were made aware that the previous owner had hanged himself from the stairwell. This will be important later on in the story. So, I was visiting my grandparents' house one particular weekend to look after their pets while they were out of state. I arrived on the Friday, early afternoon, and settled down nicely. There was nothing of any real concern, apart from the dog being a bit agitated by something. My grandparents didn't leave very often, so this was to be expected. The evening was fairly uneventful, and I went to bed early. However, that all changed at around 2 a.m. I was woken up by the dog growling, looking over at the bedroom door. I presumed she needed to go outside, so I took her out for a while. She went outside and did her business. But when we came back inside, the dog started going absolutely wild. She entered the house before me and started barking, growling, and snarling at something over by the staircase. It was very dark inside, so I couldn't really see much at first. After a few seconds, my eyes started to adjust to the dark, and I looked over in the direction my dog was staring at. I saw something, but I thought to myself, I can't possibly be seeing what I'm looking at. I rubbed my eyes to readjust my focus and looked over towards the staircase once more. What I saw when I looked over at that staircase was absolutely horrifying and has haunted my nightmares ever since. I could clearly see a pair of legs hanging from the staircase, slowly swinging backwards and forwards. Then, all of a sudden, the legs stopped swinging abruptly. They froze as if they'd been disturbed, as if they'd been alerted to my presence. The fear made my blood run cold. The panic set in, so I grabbed the dog and bolted outside. We went out to the sauna building and spent the rest of the night in there. Neither of us managed to get any sleep that night, and the dog just kept growling. Needless to say, that was the last night I ever slept over at my grandparents' house. I bought my first house in 2003, and I was absolutely over the moon. Shortly after moving in, I was outside having a conversation with two of my neighbours. They were telling me about the history of my house and joking with me about the ghost in my kitchen. Well, I presumed that they were joking, so I just played along, pretending that I'd already experienced some strange activity since moving in. That summer, as time went on, I met more and more of the local residents, and they all seemed to share similar stories about my house. Now, I was becoming slightly concerned that my house may actually be concealing some kind of dark secret. Finally, I was having a conversation with one of the elderly residents, a religious woman named Mary. She was well respected around the area and seemed very approachable, so I thought I'd ask her if there was any truth to the rumours. I knew she was very unlikely to screw with my head, which is why I asked her in the first place. It turned out that the previous owner purchased the house, then decided very soon after that they wouldn't be moving in. When asked why they had decided not to live in that house, they said it was because they were too scared to be in there at night. They said there were disembodied sounds in the night of footsteps, whispering and sobbing, and it all seemed to be coming from the kitchen. They also reported seeing glimpses of a man sitting in the kitchen, covered in blood. One of my neighbours had assisted with the renovation of the house while the previous owners were preparing to move in. He said that he was putting up some tiles in the kitchen when he felt something lift up his dreadlocks. Though I have had paranormal experiences in the past, it was many years ago, and now I just put it down to night terrors. One day, I went to a small local video store to rent a movie. I had to fill out a form with my personal and credit info, including my name, date of birth, and of course, my address. The store worker looked down at the form with a concerned look on her face. "Oh geez, you live in that house," she said. I asked her what she meant, and she told me that her former employer had committed suicide in my house. She said she came to my house as soon as she heard the news, but by that time, police had already taped the house off as a potential crime scene. She told me that the man had just moved into the house with his partner. He made a phone call to his mum to ask her to come over to visit his new house, meet his partner for the first time, and come out to her. This was in the early 90s, when being gay was a big deal. His mother already had a fairly good idea that he was gay, because he'd bought a house with a man. His mother disowned him right over the phone during that call. That very same week, he received a letter from the sexual health clinic asking him to book an emergency appointment. It was during this appointment that he was given the news that he had contracted a potentially life-threatening sexually transmitted disease. At this time, such STDs were seen as a life sentence. That night, the man sat at the kitchen table in my house and shot himself in the head with a revolver. Since the man's death, she has had multiple paranormal experiences in that store. Such experiences include videos flying off the shelves or levitating in the air. Since moving in, I have also experienced sounds coming from downstairs at night. I've heard heavy footsteps going up and down the stairs, and what sounds like crying coming from the kitchen. However, the most disturbing sound I've heard is the sound of clicking or winding, followed by a really loud bang. I had no idea what these sounds were for a while, but after speaking to that store worker, it all makes sense now. I'm pretty sure what I'm hearing is the sound of a revolver being loaded and fired. I remember my grandmother saying to me, when the dead come to you, they're coming for a reason. Perform an act of charity in their name and pray for them. So, that's exactly what I did, and this is where the story gets spooky. One night, I sat down at the kitchen table and lit a candle. I started talking out loud. I told the man that each night I would recite a novena prayer for him and light a candle. On the 9th night of praying in front of that candle, I heard footsteps slowly creeping down the stairs. The footsteps sounded slow, heavy, and laboured. The hairs were standing up on the back of my neck as the kitchen door slowly opened by itself. There was a moment of silence, which was disturbed by the sound of uncontrollable sobbing, followed by what sounded like somebody hyperventilating and gasping for breath. I was absolutely petrified as I sat in that kitchen with the spirit of the man that once lived in my house. The presence felt entirely benevolent, and I instantly felt a connection of intimacy and compassion. For 45 days, I said a novena prayer and lit a candle to pray for his soul. I also arranged to have a mass held in his name. Since then, a few times I have awoken to feel his presence standing next to my bed, but this presence now feels very much at peace. It still happens from time to time, but less and less frequently. Please let me know if you have experienced anything like this. I'm originally from California. My entire family resides in Los Angeles. For various reasons, we moved when I was about 2 years old to a small town in Texas. So, when I'm asked where I'm from, I like to flex. I'm Cali-made, Texas raised. Although some of my father's siblings made the move with us due to attractive employment opportunities, we still made frequent visits and often spent the majority of our summers on the west coast. It was always an adventure every time we went down there to visit. Some of the most bizarre experiences that occurred in my young adult life from my summers down in Cali. Although there's one very memorable moment that always stands out to me and my cousins. It's one of our core memories that we all often discuss, and now, as adults, try to figure out. This happened one summer when I was about 11 or 12 years old. Me and my cousins spent most of our days outside our grandmother's house. She lived right next to an apartment complex in Lawndale, California. Being bored always seemed to be the beginning of many great adventures. On this particular afternoon, me and my cousins decided to play Charmed. It was a bunch of us girls that played witches with powers, and our boy cousins would play the demons. It sounds silly. It was a bit like tag, only we were in teams, and we all had make-believe powers. As we were playing, we looked up to see a little girl staring down at us. She had short curly blonde hair and was dressed in a nightgown. She was looking at us with an uneasy grin and what I can only describe as being a loud stare. She was standing near a rail on the 3rd floor. I say loud stare because at some point I felt uncomfortable and broke eye contact. Just then, I looked back and all my cousins were also staring up at this girl, with a glazed look on their face, almost mesmerised. It's important to note that I was the second oldest in a group of children aged between 6 and 12 years old. For some reason, it all just felt wrong, so I shouted up, "Hey!" and all my cousins turned and looked at me. I knew something was wrong, because none of them said a word. They were just kind of frozen, speechless. The apartment complex was open and exposed to the outside. So, from my grandma's backyard, I could see up to the 2nd and 3rd floors, including all the doors that lead to the apartments. We must have turned around for a few seconds, and when we turned back, that girl was now on the 2nd floor. Me and my older cousin shared a look of absolute despair. We both knew something was seriously amiss. But in that moment, we chose not to question how the girl had moved so quickly. We didn't want to scare the younger kids who seemingly hadn't noticed. She still had the same glazed and vacant expression on her face. Then, without breaking her grin, she shouted down to ask if she could play with us. Me and my older cousin both declined the girl's request to play, and for some reason, we both started cussing her out. It's also worth me mentioning that I'm Mexican American, and in our culture, we're all taught to curse bad spirits out. I think I speak for me and my cousin when I say we knew that there was something inhuman about that girl. And at this point, my younger cousins seemed frozen in fear. Immediately after we cussed that girl out, all of the lights in the street went dim for a second, before coming back on, and then going out completely. Blackouts are fairly common in Los Angeles, so it wasn't the first time we'd experienced one. But what happened next was unexplainable. When we looked back up at that building, the young girl was now walking across the utility pole cable like a tightrope. We watched her as she maintained perfect balance while walking across that cable without breaking eye contact with us. She carried on walking across that cable before seemingly fading away into the darkness. We never saw that little girl again. Spooked, we all ran back inside, and before long, the lights came back on. My grandmother has several friends that live in that apartment complex. None of the residents knew who that girl was or where she'd come from. She was simply never seen again. This is my first Reddit post, so please bear with me. I'm visiting my grandparents and staying over for a couple of nights, as my grandfather is having some heart trouble. I wanted to make a point to see them again, and take my father with me, because they're his parents and they aren't getting any younger. I was sleeping alone, in the bedroom that is typically occupied by my grandfather. I woke up and checked my phone to see that it was about 12:30 in the morning. I had only been asleep for a few hours and really hoped that I could get a few more hours sleep. I had to drive home today, and it's a long drive, so I really needed to be able to focus. I turned over and placed my head back down on my pillow. Just as I was about to drop back off to sleep, I experienced a sharp tug on my pillow. The pillow didn't move far, but it definitely shifted from under me. I turned towards the side of the bed and saw the outline of a man standing next to me. Initially, I presumed that it was either my father or my grandfather, as it looked a bit like them. He did seem to be a little bit taller than both my father and grandfather, but it was difficult to say. I wear strong prescription glasses, and it was dark, so I couldn't make out any distinct facial features. However, my father and grandfather are both quite slim, yet this man seemed fairly overweight. Startled, I said, "Jesus Christ," expecting some kind of response, but was met with silence. So then I asked, "What's going on?" But still, there was nothing. Then I reached out to touch him, and when I did, every hair on my body stood on end, and a shiver ran down my spine. My hand went ice cold as it passed straight through the man, and he faded away within a matter of seconds. The presence definitely felt slightly ominous. I woke my father up in his room to make sure he was okay and explain everything to him. I checked in on my grandfather, who was still fast asleep at the time, and he said that he was okay. If it really was a spirit, and I didn't imagine it at all, why would it make the effort to tug my pillow and wake me up, and then say nothing at all? I don't know of any hauntings that have occurred in this house, and my grandparents have lived there for over 40 years. Have you encountered anything like this before? It was my junior year of college, and I had procrastinated the renewal of my lease. When I realised I couldn't continue living at my current house, I had scant options. Luckily, some co-workers offered me their upstairs game room for $400 a month. This was a stark difference from my previous $900 a month rent, so I jumped at the opportunity. It was only supposed to be for a 4-month stint, and by January, I would be moving back downtown with some college friends. The residents was in Montgomery, about 18 minutes from Savannah. The house itself was a dark brick home with 2 levels and a large yard, which backed up to a swampy stretch of land. The property was inundated with oak trees draped in Spanish moss. My roommates were substantially older than me, but they were still really fun to hang out with. One night, we were all playing poker in the kitchen when we heard a really loud banging at the door. It sounded like somebody was trying to enter the house, but the door was locked. We all presumed that it was our housemate Kyle and that he'd forgotten his keys. I promptly got up from the table to let him in, but when I opened the door, there was nobody there. I looked around outside, but all I saw was an empty yard. I went back to the table, and my housemates remarked too how they thought that somebody had been trying to get in. While I was somewhat confused, I didn't think that much of it, and we continued to play our games. A few weeks later, my roommate Sean had picked up a bottle of Jameson's whiskey from the store. After a brunch shift at the bar, Sean, Billy, and I decided to have a drink during the day. We were sitting at the kitchen table and had already polished off about a quarter of the bottle. We were talking about work, laughing, and taking shots. Then, abruptly, the 3 of us were prompted to look over at the linoleum countertop. I don't know what prompted us, but when I looked over my shoulder, I saw a bowl glide over the countertop in a stifled manner. It was as if a frail finger was slowly pushing the bowl across the surface. My eyes shot back to Sean and Billy, their mouths wide agape with shock. We started laughing once more, but it was that nervous, apprehensive type of laughter. "You all saw that too, didn't you?" said Billy. We reassured him, and then I stood up and walked over to that countertop. I rubbed my hand over the surface, expecting it to be damp, but it wasn't. It was bone dry. There was no breeze, no invisible string, no hidden magician. It was unsettling, but we tried to laugh it off and went back to drinking. A month or so passed, and it was October. My parents drove down from North Georgia to visit, and brought Duke, our blue heeler, with them. We walked around River Street, ate at Vic's, and then went to the Candy Kitchen. It was great family time. After dinner, my parents told me that their hotel wasn't cool with pets, and asked if I could keep Duke overnight. I was all for this, and checked with my roommates that this would be okay, and they all said that it was fine. When Duke and I were dropped off at the house, I took him inside. He played with my roommates for a while, and when it got late, I took him up to the games room. My bed was awkwardly placed in the corner of the room, and it faced 2 large windows on the wall opposite me. At some point, I fell asleep, with Duke curled up at the foot of the bed. I'm a very heavy sleeper. It takes a lot to wake me up. Yet, out of a deep sleep, I woke up to a low, guttural growl. Moonlight shone in through the windows, and I saw Duke standing, staring at something. His hackles were raised, and this low, deep, guttural growl, which I'd never heard before, persisted. He was looking up at something I couldn't see. But whatever it was, it seemed to be looming over the bed. I instantly felt uneasy, and I grabbed the dog and brought him closer to me. This seemed to lull his aggression, and I somehow managed to fall back to sleep. When November rolled around, I decided I'd be attending my family's Thanksgiving in North Georgia. Our house is on a small cattle farm up in Elijah, and it's especially nice there in the fall. I drove up and visited for a couple of days. One afternoon, I felt overwhelmingly tired, so I decided to go upstairs to take a nap. When I woke up, however, I couldn't move. I could feel my forehead beading with sweat. From the corner of my eye, I could see my mirror, which was positioned just above my dresser. What I saw when I looked into that reflection induced an absolute feeling of terror. An old woman, pale, bony, and damp, lingered over me. She had jet black hair and exuded an energy of apprehension and malice. At this point, I was totally freaking out, struggling to break free from this paralysis. After a few moments, however, I snapped out of it. My heart was racing, and I leapt out of bed. I looked around the room, and that old woman from the reflection was now nowhere to be seen. December was my final month at the house, and one evening my roommates and I were taking turns playing chess. I don't remember how we got onto the subject, but we started talking about death and dying. Billy then asked Sean about the old woman that used to live in the house. Sean was a no-nonsense type, honest to a point, and as far from sensational as a person could be. He paused for a second and looked at me. He proceeded to tell the story of the previous owners, a story that had been told to him by the neighbours. There was an older couple that previously resided in that house. The gentleman had severe dementia, and his wife was his primary caregiver. One day, the old man was found aimlessly wandering around the neighbourhood, and a neighbour returned him to the house. When they arrived back at the house, and they opened the door, the neighbour was met with a rancid stench in the air. He called for the man's wife, but there was no response. Concerned, the neighbour looked for the man's wife throughout the house. When he reached the master bedroom, that stench was overwhelming. There, in the bed, was the old woman, deceased. She had passed away in that bed, and remained there for a long period of days. I got cold chills when I heard this story. I couldn't help but think back to that odd paralysis episode I had, and all the other oddities that had occurred in that house. I no longer live there, and the home has since been sold. Perhaps it was all unrelated anomalies and tricks of the subconscious, though, in all honesty, I think something otherworldly was at play in the kitchen, halls, and bedrooms of that house in Montgomery. This all began a few days ago, when a good friend of mine, Scott, moved into his new apartment. He asked for some help moving in during the weekend, and I figured it'd probably only take about an hour, so I offered to help. As me and Scott were moving his things into his apartment, we could both sense that something just didn't quite feel right. It really felt like we were being watched. The apartment complex itself is quite old,
so we thought nothing of it. We thought maybe it was just the feeling of moving into a new place, and we continued moving his stuff in. It only took about an hour to move everything in, and then Scott asked me if I wanted to stay and watch a movie. It was very late, and we both ended up falling asleep. We were awoken to one of the worst smells by far I've ever encountered. Both myself and Scott are hunters, and we both knew immediately what that smell was. It was the smell of rotting flesh. It smelled so terrible, the whole house absolutely reeked of it. And then, within seconds, just like that, it smelt normal again. We were both really freaked out. The next day, Scott was determined to find out where that smell was coming from. Scott told his landlord he thought an animal had crawled into the ventilation and died. But when the landlord sent somebody to check the ventilation out, the man found nothing. I called Scott later while I was at work and asked him if he'd had any more experiences like the previous night. He said he kept hearing knocking sounds in the walls, and items around the house kept being misplaced. He asked me if I'd come back over that night. It was late when I got to his house, and again I got that really uneasy feeling as I walked through the door. I want to point out that both myself and Scott are Christian. We don't profess to any specific denomination, but we attend a small non-denominational church every Sunday and have strong faith in Jesus Christ. The house still felt off, but smelled normal again. We agreed that maybe we just overreacted the other night. It was late and we were both very tired. That is when we heard it. Slow and heavy footsteps walking down the hallway, with the sounds of chains rattling behind, followed very shortly after, again, by that rancid smell of rotting flesh. Scott stepped forward and said, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command any and all evil to leave this place." Almost immediately, the house fell silent. The smell was gone, and everything just felt normal again. That was a couple of days ago now, and Scott hasn't had any experiences since that night. Hopefully, whoever, or whatever, was in that apartment is now gone for good. Scott has done a little bit of research since what happened. Many years ago, there was an old woman that lived in that complex, just a few doors down from Scott's apartment. Apparently, the old woman took her own life. We have no idea if this has anything to do with what me and Scott encountered, or if it was just a mere coincidence. Whatever the case, neither myself or Scott will ever forget it.
I'm a female. I'm 34 years old, and this is my story. Around 2006, my cousin moved into an apartment with her new husband. It was only a few blocks away from where I lived with my mother at the time. My cousin went on to have a baby whilst living in that apartment, and the baby was born with health difficulties. It turns out he's on the spectrum and is also non-verbal. In 2014, I was looking for a place to buy, and my cousin offered me her apartment. They wanted to have another child, and the apartment was just too small. She made me an offer that turned out to be really good for the both of us. So much so that I was able to pay the apartment off directly to her within a year. I moved into the apartment in the middle of 2015. I decorated the place with a mix of new and thrifted furniture. I had a specific look I was going for. For my bedroom, I had a century-old wardrobe professionally renovated. It was a gorgeous piece of furniture. Everything was fine for a while, but then, in 2016, I started to suffer from sleep paralysis. I would never see any demons, like some people do, but nevertheless, it was a terrifying experience. I also experienced lucid dreaming without ever trying to achieve it. It just happened. Then, in 2017, I started hearing noises in the apartment at night. Now, here's the thing. I have 3 cats, so most noises at night don't scare me in the slightest. I always just presume it's one of the cats acting up. But the noise I was hearing was very specific. It came from the corner of the room where that wardrobe was. It sounded just like somebody was snoring or breathing heavily while sleeping. I tried my best to rationalise this, but I just couldn't explain that noise. Some nights, it would bother me so much that I'd actually get up and look around for the source of the noise. It really felt and sounded like somebody was asleep in that room with me. For context, I've had the same neighbours in that apartment for many years now, so it couldn't be that suddenly I can hear into their bedroom, although I did consider every possibility. I was absolutely certain that somehow that wardrobe was to blame. Maybe it had brought something or someone with it. So I made the decision to dismantle the wardrobe and I got rid of it. All except for the base. I decided to DIY it into a little sofa. I stopped hearing that noise at night, and so I was really pleased. A few weird things would happen every now and then, like objects would still move on their own, or break inexplicably. In 2019, I got another new cat. She was a tiny kitten, and I called her Gigi. All my cats were indoor cats. They always had been, and Gigi was no exception. She had never had a life outside of my apartment. It was all she ever knew, and yet she was extremely skittish. Everything seemed to scare her. She would spend most of her days hiding behind things. To this day, I still find it really hard to explain her behaviour. I guess some cats are just naturally very anxious. Nothing weird happened in the apartment in 2020 or 2021, which was good because I was isolated in the apartment by myself most of the time. Even Gigi was a little less nervous. Perhaps this was because there were no people coming and going. In 2022, I moved to another country for work, and one of my other cousins came to stay at the apartment to look after the cats. Eventually, her son moved in too, because the apartment was close to his university, so he was living there by himself for a while. One day, he told his mum that he heard a weird noise in the bedroom at night. He said it sounded just like somebody was snoring in the bedroom right next to him. His girlfriend said she could never hear a thing when she came to stay over, but he was adamant that he could hear it most nights. Sometime later, he went to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, and he swears he could see a figure standing there. He said it was a woman with a really creepy smile on her face. He pretended he hadn't seen her, and went back to bed. I honestly have no idea how he didn't run for his life. That is the first thing I would have done. Around the same time, Gigi started acting even more weird than usual. She would try hiding in high places, and by doing that, she would knock things over and end up breaking things. She knocked over mirrors, picture frames, and even shelving units. My cousin's son would often find her hiding in strange places in the morning, like on top of kitchen units. These were pretty high and hard to get to, even for a cat. But she seemed determined to hide, or even escape, from something. In late 2023, I went back to my hometown to empty the apartment. I stayed there by myself with the cats for several weeks whilst packing up. One night, I dreamt that I was in bed, just as I was in real life, and I was lying on my side, FaceTiming my boyfriend. We had our cameras on, and at one point, as I looked into my own image on the screen, I could see a woman behind me. I turned around as quickly as possible, and there she was right above me. I had a weird thought like, there you are, I'm gonna get you. So, I grabbed the woman around her neck with all my strength. I knocked her off me and she fell to the floor. Then, she disappeared and I woke up. It felt real, in a weird kind of way, like I was really proud of myself, and I hoped that she got the message. I went on with my day, feeling pretty good, and at night time, I was on my own again. I was feeling a little uneasy, so I decided to close the bedroom door and sleep on the couch in the living room. Suddenly, I heard the loudest, craziest noise coming from the bedroom. It sounded like 1,000 pots and pans had just fallen off the shelves. It was insanely loud. My cats jumped off me and hid. I walked to the bedroom, absolutely convinced that something must have fallen off the one shelf left on the wall. But no. To my surprise, everything was still in place. But my heart was racing and my cats were petrified. I was trying my best to rationalise that noise. Maybe it came from another apartment. But then, I got a phone call from my mum. She asked me if I was okay, as she had a weird feeling that something might be wrong. So, I told her what had happened just a minute before, and she told me to go over to her place ASAP. I put my cats in the car, which wasn't a very easy task as they were so afraid, and drove over to my mum's. I did go back there a few more times during the day just to finish packing, but I never stayed there overnight again. It's been several months now, and I've still not managed to rent it out or sell it. Mainly because I'm too afraid to spend too much time there, taking photos and such. The funny thing is, sometimes you tell people these stories, and people find it hard to believe that you'd stay in a place for so long believing that it might be haunted. But really, you just try your best to rationalise it as much as you can. And the activity happens intermittently, so it's easy to just brush it off as an isolated incident. Interestingly, I was clinically depressed whilst I was living in that apartment. I did make a lot of really bad choices back then. Nowadays, I wouldn't quite say my life is simple, as I permanently live in a different country. I have a partner and kids, and I work really hard so that I can come back to visit my family as often as possible. But, despite the difficulties, a cloud has definitely lifted, and life is good.